Hey, it's Trey. As we begin a new year and the start of a second administration under President Donald Trump, we leave a contentious election behind. However, the nation remains sharply divided on a number of pivotal issues, from immigration to healthcare, from education to international tariffs. And one of the most divisive continues to be reproductive rights. The Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade more than 2 years ago, eliminating the federal constitutional right to abortion. Since then, 41 states have implemented abortion bans with limited exceptions. With Republicans taking over control of Congress and the White House, and electoral support for a conservative platform, many state legislatures are poised to impose even tighter restrictions on abortion. Abortion rights advocates are providing access to reproductive care as they can. But there's already a blueprint of sorts to follow, because this is a road that's been traveled before. Many are looking to lessons learned half a century ago, before there was a right to legal abortion. Lessons from people like Reverend Jim Lewis, now a retired Episcopal minister, known for tackling social justice issues head on. So, Jim, you helped women get abortions back in the 1960s and the early 1970s before the Roe decision. And that was when abortion was illegal in most states. You helped them to get to places like New York. What were the personal and political risks of doing that at that time?
Well, it was against the law, first off, in West Virginia. And so that was a factor.
More than 50 years ago, women began coming to Reverend Lewis in West Virginia for guidance on how best to handle a troubled pregnancy. Some were victims of rape and domestic abuse. Lewis became convinced that change was crucial.
So I started listening, and then I realized the law in West Virginia was not good at all. And so connected with a group in New York called the Clergy Consultation Network.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them, the show that tells the stories about the things that divide us and can bring us together. I'm Trey Kay. As the 2024 election season was winding to a close, Us and Them sat down with two people from two different eras who've championed the fight for reproductive rights in West Virginia. The Reverend Jim Lewis and Margaret Chapman Pomponio, Executive Director of West Virginia Free, a reproductive health rights and justice nonprofit. In the late 1960s, Lewis connected with Howard Moody, a pastor at Judson Memorial Church in Greenwich Village, New York, where abortions at the time were legal. Moody was one of several New York clergy who founded the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion. They referred women from other states where abortions were illegal for services in New York.
We then had a big meeting in Charleston. I flew down here from Martinsburg, and big meeting, and about a dozen clergy got together and covered the state of West Virginia as a clergy consultation network here.
That was, for all practical purposes, the informal West Virginia chapter of the New York-based Clergy Consultation Service on abortion. Can you give me an idea of what that clergy was like? Was what types of denominations, et cetera?
Well, we had the group that originally came together were all Christians, and the chaplain at Marshall University was the guy who brought us together, Howard and Marion, and we were men and one woman, chaplain at West Virginia University, and we met in Charleston with Moody and formed what really was a clergy consultation network, an outsourced group who would help women get to New York City.
Back in the 1960s and 70s, West Virginia clerical leaders helped pregnant women with a range of choices. Some wanted to give up their babies for adoption. Others decided to keep their babies and find a way to raise them. Still, others wanted to terminate their pregnancies, but had no way to pay for an abortion or travel to New York. The clergy group helped facilitate a woman's choice, even providing resources for an out-of-state abortion. The effort is similar to what abortion rights advocates face today. However, Reverend Lewis says some of what's changed since then is the makeup of abortion opponents.
Well, obviously, the Roman Catholic Church was very much involved in funding anti-abortion and preaching it and teaching it in the pew. So, I ran into that quickly.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is that was it different then than it is now? It seems to me that when I think of the anti-abortion movement, I think more of people who would be from the evangelical fundamentalist Christian fold. But I'm just wondering if you can help me understand that at that time was that faction more involved, or was it more something that was being driven from the Catholic Church?
Well, I wouldn't say driven by the Catholic Church, but certainly they contributed to it. But what we're having was the beginning of more evangelical, independent, fundamental religion coming together, organizing. I mean, a lot of organizing took place on the left in the 60s, and some of the same tactics were being used here by these people, which means today we have an evangelical nationalism. It's really dangerous. And we come up against a lot of First Amendment issues, and it's a serious movement right now. So I would say what was growing then here in West Virginia has now given full bloom across this nation. I mean, really bad.
I'm digging on this point here. As I understand it, and I'm younger than you.
Everybody's younger than me.
That's true. But in my understanding of history, it seemed like evangelicals seemed to get more involved in the 1980s than say the early 1970s, around the time of the Roe decision. So I'm just trying to understand the terrain of the people that you were engaged with.
This was a response to all the stuff that had happened in the 60s. I mean, things were wild. And if you look at the history of the 60s, you can see that there was a real reaction that we're not going to let this happen again. We're going to get the students, and we're going to build a movement that will be able to stand up against the folks that do this. And the human sexuality was a huge piece of that. It really was.
When you say we're not going to let this happen again, I'm thinking back to the early part of the 1960s of the Abington v. Shemp and I can't think of the other Supreme Court decision, but that was the prayer in school decision.
Oh my, and that's been constant throughout, still is. It's still pressing that we want to have prayers in school, and we want to have the Ten Commandments on the wall of all church schools. It didn't die.
The Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 recognized a constitutional right to abortion. With that, the clergy consultation service on abortion disbanded. However, Reverend Jim Lewis says efforts opposed to legal abortion continued. There were legal challenges and state laws designed to place some limits on abortion. When the Roe v. Wade decision was overturned in 2022, it put a spotlight on the conservative Christian movement with its hardline stance against abortion. That exploded into the 2024 election cycle. We've seen voters in a number of states adopt reproductive rights into their constitutions. But the abortion issue was one of many that paved a way for a sea of Republican victories, both in state and national races. Already in this post-Roe era, abortion rights supporters say the new abortion restrictions are draconian. and expected to become even more so in the coming months. There's a groundswell of support for what worked before Roe, for clergy leaders to help women gain access to reproductive care. That's coming up after a break. You're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part by the CRC Foundation.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Hey, it's Trey, and you're listening to Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Now that the fight for reproductive rights is in front of state lawmakers, they are dictating their own policies, with many, including West Virginia, all but banning abortion. As a result, approaches like those used half a century ago are providing a blueprint. Before Roe v. Wade created a constitutional right to legal abortion, Reverend Jim Lewis and other West Virginia clerical leaders helped women access abortion services. Today, he's working with Margaret Chapman Pomponio, who's the executive director of West Virginia Free, a reproductive health rights and justice organization.
I'm wondering, how do you see the change in the coalition of people who are against abortion now? At the time, it seemed to be mostly the Catholic Church, and as Jim says, that there was kind of a waxing of the evangelical, and it's kind of grown more that way. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I still see those players involved today. Certainly, fundamentalist Christians are key players. I will say, when Obamacare was up for debate at the national level, we at West Virginia Free, and I personally did a lot of work on that legislation because we knew that it would be good for West Virginians to have more health care. And abortion became a major problem with that legislation, in large part thanks to the Catholic Church. And we saw the bishops having a lot of influence with the crafting of that legislation.
For decades, after the Supreme Court ruling Roe v. Wade granted legal access to abortion, abortion opponents have worked to overturn it. A variety of state laws added restrictions and requirements to make abortions more complicated and more costly. In fact, some of those state laws were written as a direct challenge to the Roe ruling, designed to have it taken up by the Supreme Court. And when the justices did overturn that right to legal abortion, it wasn't long before abortion rights supporters found ways, once again, to help women seeking abortions in states that all but banned the procedure. And once again, Reverend Jim Lewis is at the forefront of those conversations, along with Margaret Chapman Pomponio. Together, they attended a convention in New Orleans back in May of 2024.
So the conference that you went to, I think it's the Spiritual Alliance of Churches for Reproductive Dignity, right? So tell me about that.
So it's a conglomeration of people of faith and interfaith movement to really validate the individual autonomy and dignity of each person to have control over their reproductive destinies, and that it's a counter argument in some ways to the idea that if you're religious, you have to be anti-abortion.
Right.
And so we think this is a really important space for people of faith to be in, to reclaim that. Because, I can speak as an Episcopalian. We are rooted in the idea of compassion and love and acceptance and justice. And so I think that we're specifically called to do this work. And it was a convening of faith leaders, spiritual people committed to reproductive rights and justice within a faith-based framework.
There, Margaret and Jim met with other members of the little-known religious left and led discussions about bringing back the clergy consultation service on abortion, the network from more than 50 years ago.
And so we were on a panel discussing this very topic of rebooting the clergy consultation service for the 21st century. And we were joined by speakers from Catholics for Choice, National Council of Jewish Women, and an Ohio faith-based reproductive rights organization. And Jim was the only person on the panel that actually was part of the original network. And it was wonderful. It was very well received. And, through that work, we learned that people are having these discussions in other states that have abortion bans. I think we knew early on, as soon as the ban was enacted in West Virginia, that it was time to reboot this network of faith leaders in West Virginia. We had already been in conversation about the desire to reboot the clergy consultation service here in West Virginia. So it didn't spark from that conference. We already had been discussing that. And that's something that I think always comes as, not always, but often comes as a surprise to people outside of West Virginia, that podunk West Virginia hillbillies would be on the cutting edge of all this stuff. And the fact is, we have on a number of social justice issues and abortion and public health, the death penalty. Jim has been at the forefront of a lot of that. And so, we learned after I reached out to them that there were other conversations happening. And that's the beauty of getting people together, right? It's the beauty of having this community stitched together across the country to try to make safety nets for women who need compassionate, safe health care. And, you look at the two women that recently died in Georgia, and, they are two Black women who were harmed, with their very lives because of these abortion bans. And so, I often say that we knew that banning abortion was never going to stop abortion. And so it's our job to try to make it as safe and accessible as possible.
For now, the drug used for medication abortions, called mifepristone, can be sent legally through the mail. But many expect that to change, or at least to be challenged once Donald Trump becomes president. And even if medication abortions remain legal, they are only an option in the early weeks of pregnancy. And so the clergy consultation service on abortion has to consider the practical elements of supporting women in the choices they make.
When we look at the map of places where abortion is illegal and places where it is, and when I ask you the question, do we need to transport people, and because we have mifepristone, and you're saying we need both. We need both. With regard to transporting, is there a network of how we're doing that, or is this something that is specific to each state as to how the groups are trying to help women get to places where they can get safe abortions?
Yeah, definitely. There's a network. There's National Network of Abortion Funds, and so they provide both financial and practical support, meaning help with lodging or gas money. I do not think that there is a network of people who are connecting to drive people out of state, that was a big point of discussion in West Virginia right after abortion was banned. And what we learned really was that people would like to go on their own. And so they really just need connections with resources to help them on their way.
Jim, did you want to get on that?
Oh, goodness, so much. If we think that pills are going to solve it, listen to the conversation, because declare it a controlled substance. You can't go in a drugstore and buy a controlled substance unless you have approval to do that. There are lots of ways, and listen to the conversation politically. We're talking about the move now to have more children and single people. Where does it leave them? We're going to talk about birth control pills now, and don't think that we can't have control by government over the medications. It sounds good, and it does work. We're saying they need both of them, but the government has a way of controlling substances. And when I hear controlled substance and talking about pills for women, I hear control these women. That's what I hear.
Supporters of reproductive rights are braced for a fight at the state and national levels. Organizations are making connections, plans are underway, and training is set to begin. They say efforts like the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion 2.0 will be ready.
We knew early on, as soon as the ban was enacted in West Virginia, that it was time to reboot this network of faith leaders in West Virginia. So the work that we're doing is still in the initial stages, doing personal outreach to clergy. We're going to be watching a series of reproductive justice political education seminars together Tuesday evenings. So I think that's another excellent springboard for this work. And then the goal is to start training clergy on how to be compassionate listeners and helpers for people who need to terminate pregnancy, and get them trained in the spring of 25.
As we begin a new legislative season, anti-abortion forces are also poised with state and federal policies designed to restrict medication abortion. Many focus on regulating the drug mifepristone. In addition, there are continuing efforts to enact a federal ban on abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Coming up on the next episode of Us and Them, we'll look at the ways state legislatures and courts are taking up much of the policy work on abortion. Voters in 7 more states have approved ballot initiatives with a constitutional right to an abortion. However, state Supreme Courts, some packed with conservative justices, will decide how that right will be applied. And the new Trump administration can take executive actions that would undermine all these voter-approved amendments. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this show was me, Trey Kay, Maria Young, Matthew Hancock, and Kate Smith. Michael Lipton, Tristan Lozow, and Ahmed Solomon wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the CRC Foundation. Hey, we'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Would you share them with us on our Facebook page or on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Us Them Podcast? Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. Hey, we'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.